This is New Day. It's Monday, August 14th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Allison is off. Poppy Harlow joining me. Thank you for doing so. Be together all week. Here's our starting line. Democrats and Republicans united in blasting the president's response to the violence sparked by white supremacists in Virginia. The president did condemn violence, but said on many sides, twice, he said something that shocks the conscience of members of both political parties and people across this country. The vice president, Mike Pence, defending the president, blasting the media for scrutinizing his deafening silence. But then the vice president did exactly what the president did not do. He condemned white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK by name.
And naming them is critical. Meantime, the suspected attacker will be arraigned in just a few hours. He's accused of driving his car straight into that crowd, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer for standing up to hate and voicing that. A high school teacher says the suspect was a Nazi sympathizer who long idolized Adolf Hitler. All of this as America's top general is in South Korea pushing for a diplomatic solution. Yet he says military options are indeed prepared in case sanctions on North Korea fail to defuse the nuclear threat. We have this all covered for you on a busy Monday morning. Let's begin with CNN's Jeff Zeleny. He is live in Bridgewater, New Jersey, where the president is on this working vacation. Still, retweets from the president this morning of other things, political things, but silence on this.
Good morning, Poppy. It is a vague silence. We have heard President Trump, of course, he's known for being outspoken and blunt when he wants to be. But Sunday, yesterday, marked only the fourth day of his presidency where he was completely silent on social media. Now, all of this is coming as he's facing renewed criticism over failing to call out those white supremacists from the deadly violence in Charlottesville.
We have no tolerance for hate and violence from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or the KKK.
Vice President Mike Pence doing publicly what President Trump did not over the weekend, directly condemning white supremacists by name after the deadly violence in Charlottesville.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
The vice president coming to the president's defense in the face of growing backlash over Mr. Trump's response.
President Trump clearly and unambiguously condemned the bigotry, violence, and hatred which took place. I take issue with the fact that many in the national media spend more time criticizing the president's words than they did criticizing those who perpetrated the violence to begin with.
The White House releasing a statement from an unnamed spokesperson Sunday, 36 hours after the protest began, insisting President Trump's comments decrying bigotry includes white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazi, and all extremist groups. Top aides to the president also pushing back on the Sunday shows.
The president's been very clear. We cannot tolerate this kind of bigotry, this kind of hatred.
The president not only condemned the violence and stood up at a time and a moment when calm was necessary, and didn't dignify the names of these groups and people, but rather addressed the fundamental issue.
President Trump ignored multiple questions from reporters after his statement on Saturday.
Mr. President, do you want the support of these white nationalist groups who say they support you, Mr. President?
Mr. President,
have you denounced them strongly enough?
A car-flying group of people, would you call that terrorism, sir?
We just aren't seeing leadership from the White House.
The president's refusal to denounce the groups by name drawing fierce backlash from his own party.
And I would urge the president to dissuade them of the fact that he's sympathetic to their cause, because their cause is hate. It is un-American. They are domestic terrorists, and we need more from our president.
Call this white supremacism, this white nationalism evil, and let the country hear it, let the world hear it. It's something that needs to come from the Oval Office, and this White House needs to do it today.
Now, the president is interrupting his working vacation here in New Jersey to fly back to Washington later this morning to sign an unrelated piece of legislation on China trade policy. But, Poppy, still so many questions here about the president's comments on this. White House aides tell me this morning they believe he will take questions on
Bannon a little later and hope the president does take those important questions today in that press conference he promised that he would have. The man accused of driving a car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer, injuring 19 others. He will be arraigned in just hours. A former teacher of the attacker claims that he proudly proclaimed himself a Nazi sympathizer. Let's go to Kaylee Hartung. She is live in Charlottesville. What else are we learning ahead of this arraignment?
Well, Poppy, James Alex Fields Jr. will be arraigned at 10 a.m. this morning. He's currently being held in the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, and he will remain there and appear in the courtroom today via a video teleconference. He'll be facing one charge of second-degree murder. Among others, the DOJ and the FBI also conducting a civil rights investigation into the assault. Now, investigators will be looking into this man's past to help determine his motive, and we're learning more about the 20-year-old man from Ohio. While his mother said just moments after learning of the charges against her son that she'd never really discussed his political beliefs with him, one of his high school teachers is providing some insight.
He had some very radical views on race. He was very infatuated with the Nazis, with Adolf Hitler. He also had a huge military history, especially with like German military history in World War II. But he was pretty infatuated with that stuff.
The U.S. Army confirms to our Pentagon reporter Barbara Starr that Fields reported for basic training in August of 2015. He didn't meet the basic training standards and he left the service in December of that same year. We're also learning more about the victim, 32-year-old Heather Heyer from the Charlottesville area. There was a vigil scheduled last night in her honor, but because of perceived threats, the organizers canceled the event. Mourners continue to lay flowers at the crash site as a makeshift memorial has been set up there. Now, Heyer's mother says that she had always been someone wanting to help others.
It was important to her to speak up for people that she felt were not being heard, to speak up when injustices were happening. And she saw in the lives of many of her African American friends particularly, and her gay friends, that equal rights were not being given.
Heyer was a paralegal for a Charlottesville law firm. Now, the law enforcement community also mourning the loss of two of their own as a helicopter crashed as it was surveying the violence in the area. Pilot Lieutenant H.J. Cullen and Trooper Pilot Burke Bates lost their lives. Now, Governor Terry McAuliffe knew both of these men personally. As he said, these heroes were a part of our family and we are simply heartbroken. The president also offered his condolences on Twitter. On this Monday morning, the barricades that we saw in this park throughout the weekend, the center of the controversy here in Emancipation Park, where Confederate General Robert E. Lee's statue stands. Well, those barricades are gone. The streets are open. But, Poppy, there is a lot of healing left to do in Charlottesville.
All right, Kaylee, thank you very much. Let's bring in our political panel. CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein and CNN political analysts John Avlon and Abby Phillip. John Avlon, we want to keep mentioning Heather Heyer. We want to keep mentioning the troopers because hate took lives down there in Virginia. And we want to remember the people that were resistant to that hatred. That's important. Equally important is the message from our leadership. And Mike Pence, the vice president, can say whatever he wants. The president created a WTF moment with what he did and did not say about this event. Him repeating on many sides, didn't just not make sense contextually, but is completely baffling given the circumstances. How do you explain it?
I don't think you can explain it, which is why the White House has been scrambling, trying to play offense, but not really addressing the president's problem, which is doubling down on that on many sides comment on the day this was all going down. Look, this isn't really subtle here, folks. This isn't a high bar for presidential leadership, condemning neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And even on the Friday night in the square, there are young men giving Nazi salutes in front of a statue of Robert E. Lee. If that's not, that's not a misunderstanding, that's nothing you should consider any part of your base. That's something that needs to be clearly condemned. And if it can't be clearly condemned, then people got to look really hard in the mirror. And that's not to say the president is a part of these groups, but if he is in any way encouraging or empowering these groups, as online comments subsequent to the statement said from neo-Nazi websites, basically saying he called the other side haters, this is a victory for us. That's a problem. If it can't be seen, it needs to be confronted. We need to have this conversation as a country now.
If you stand by silently then what? This country has learned that lesson too many times. Ron Brownstein, something from John Meacham that stood out to me on Twitter last night and got a lot of people talking. History will judge the president's wordplay over resurgent white nationalism harshly, and later, white nationalism, the KKK. Does it matter if the president doesn't say it out loud?
Sure, and I think he's already sent the message that he means to send. I actually don't think this is a WTF moment or hard to explain. It's hard to justify. It's not hard to explain. It's exactly to the T what he did with David Duke on the Sunday before the key southern states voted in the Republican primary last year, where he sent his clear signal by what he did not say initially, by not condemning him. And then only when elite opinion and kind of broad opinion across both parties condemned him did he come out with the denunciation, which I am sure is coming eventually here too after this signal has been sent.
Let's play it. This is what he said to Jake back when he was being asked about this during the campaign with David Duke. All right. Well, we will have it in a little bit. And
just to finish the point, which is you know, there is a relatively small, there's a minuscule percentage of Americans who completely sympathize with KKK or Nazi ideology and imagery, but there are a much broader universe of Americans who are uneasy about demographic, racial, and cultural change. And from the beginning, President Trump has signaled his sympathy to those voters in a variety of ways, from the ways he described Mexicans in the first, you know, his first press conference, and saying that Judge Curiel could not, judge fairly in a case because of his heritage, to what he said about David Duke. And he has.
Well, here it is, Ron. Let's listen to this so people have some context. Here's the sound.
Absolutely.
I didn't even know he endorsed me. David Duke endorsed me? Okay. All right. I disavow. Okay?
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists.
Now, just for timing context, one, we screwed up and we flipped those two bites. The disavowal came after it. And also, it just wasn't that it was about what he was saying. He had complete evidence of who David Duke was. And he had also denied him earlier. He once was going to run for president with part of this party called the Reform Party, and Duke was connected to it. And he said at that time, I don't want anything to do with this guy. I don't want to be connected to him. So now it changed.
Just to finish the point, Chris, it was the Sunday before the largest number of southern states voted in the Republican primary. So, I mean, that was very calculated. And then eventually, he kind of provides the denunciation that the bipartisan critics demand, but after he has sent his signal. And again, he has done very well from the beginning with the elements of American society that are most uneasy about racial changes. This big debate was his vote driven by economic anxiety or cultural and demographic anxiety. In fact, the two are braided together. And many of the same voters are most uneasy, feel the most eclipsed by what's happening in the economy and what's happening demographically. And the president has been unwilling to kind of draw a clear, bright line isolating these groups, not, I think, because so many Americans are sympathetic to them, but because it's part of a continuum of views that he has played on and has spoken to, I think, as clearly as he possibly could.
Abby, New York Times editorial board this morning writes, Mr. Trump is alone in modern presidential history in his willingness to summon the demons of bigotry and intolerance in service to himself. He began his political career on a lie about President Barack Obama's citizenship and has failed to firmly condemn the words and deeds of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan leaders, and other bigots who rallied behind him. Your thoughts this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to go all the way back to the time when the president was thinking of running for president, and he decided that what he was going to do was talk about President Obama's birth certificate and the fact that he wasn't he was born in Hawaii, and insinuate that he was in fact born in Kenya. That was the foundation of a racist lie that really spoke to something that a lot of Republicans had for a long time wanted to shove into a corner. Donald Trump at that time spoke directly to it. This is a very analogous situation. I think that politicians have always known that these people are out there, the David Dukes, the white supremacists. They've been out there for a long time. I think Republican politicians have shoved them in a corner, but Donald Trump is not doing that. That is not an accident. And it's also incredibly telling that, you know, this is a presidency that has for text of other presidents. And the fact that white supremacists, the KKK, can march in Charlottesville with torches and then later kill someone, allegedly, with a vehicle in what appears to be an intentional attack. And the president doesn't speak at all to the long history of these groups terrorizing African Americans in this country is a second part of this broader failure of this president to address the moment. Violence aside, the existence of KKK in the streets should draw condemnation. And that didn't happen. It's very telling. There's no acknowledgement that there's a history here, that it's not just today, that over a long period of time, these folks, these individuals and these groups were responsible for domestic terrorism for a large swath of this country. And, you know, the president still hasn't spoken out about that, despite all of the corrections and the revisions of his statement from his staff and from the vice president.
Well, look, and Abby, as you beautifully point out, the morality is fairly clear here. So is the logic. Remember, this president hammered the idea of calling terror and calling evil what it is. And then now with this, they argue, well, we didn't want to dignify the names of these groups. It's logically inconsistent, and it was morally vacant. And why that was, we don't know, but the White House should say more about it.
And I think that parallel is exactly right. By focusing on, we need to name the problem of radical Islamist terrorism, but silent on this. And Abby has eloquently pointed out that this is also the flip side of a defiantly ahistorical approach to the presidency. You cannot lead the nation if you don't want to deal with its history or perhaps don't understand it. And, you know, we've also played footsie for a long time with this idea that part of his base is ethno-nationalist. That's a very polite term for what is, in fact, white nationalist. And white nationalist is white supremacist.
All right, so in the next hour, we're going to talk to the mayor of Charlottesville and find out what's going on down there. As Kaylee Harding told us, the streets are back open, but what's the mood? And what should be the legacy of this situation? Then in the 8 o'clock hour, we're going to talk with a woman who was at the scene of that terrible car ramming, and she knew the victim, Heather Heyer. We'll get some perspective on what brought this young woman there and what she was about.
So important to remember her name and what she was fighting for that day. So is the growing criticism against President Trump's response to everything that unfolded in Charlottesville a sign that one of his closest advisors could soon be on the outs? The latest controversy, what it all means for Steve Bannon next.
Romans, it's Monday, August 14th. It is 5 a.m. exactly in the East. We'll be live from South Korea and Syria later in the hour. But first, President Trump under fire for failing to explicitly denounce the role of white nationalists and neo-Nazis in clashes with counter-protesters that turned deadly in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was left to Vice President Mike Pence, who's traveling in Latin America, to say what the president did not.
We have no tolerance for hate and violence from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or the KKK. These dangerous fringe groups have no place in American public life and in the American debate, and we condemn them in the strongest possible terms. The president's call for unity yesterday, though, was from the heart. It was a sincere call in these two divided times in our country.
Now, Democrats and Republicans alike slammed the president's initial response to the violence in Charlottesville and his reluctance to single out the extremists, some of whom have been and are Trump supporters. He said this.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
On many sides. A White House statement Sunday tried to clarify the president's remarks, saying he condemns all forms of violence, bigotry, and hatred. And of course, that includes white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK.
That's clearly not enough for members of the president's own party, who are pleading with him to speak out forcefully and directly against white nationalist groups, calling the killing in Charlottesville more than just murder. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida tweeting, quote, very important for the nation to hear the president describe events in Charlottesville for what they are, a terror attack by white supremacists. And this from senior Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah. We should call evil by its name. My brother didn't give his life fighting Hitler for Nazi ideas to go unchallenged here at home.
GOP leaders are not only calling on the president to condemn white supremacy groups by name, they're pressing him to do it now so those groups don't become emboldened.
I would urge the president to dissuade them of the fact that he's sympathetic to their cause, because their cause is hate. It is un-American. They are domestic terrorists, and we need more from our president on this issue.
This president needs to do exactly that today. Call this white supremacism, this white nationalism evil, and let the country hear it, let the world hear it. It's something that needs to come from the Oval Office, and this White House needs to do it today.
Meantime, the president's own daughter and advisor, Ivanka Trump, had this to say in response to the Charlottesville violence. There should be no place in society for racism, white supremacy, and neo-Nazis. We must all come together as Americans and be one country united. Let's talk more now with CNN politics reporter Eugene Scott. Nice to see you this morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
That clarified statement from the White House, from a spokesman to the pool, basically saying, you know, he called for unity, he called for bringing all Americans together.
An unnamed spokesman.
Trying to, it appears, trying to strengthen the statement from the White House.
Yeah.
It just reminds you the omission there, what the president didn't say in his initial response.
Absolutely. And if the president really believes this, why would that person not want to go on the record? Why would the president himself not want to speak as clearly as we saw Lindsey Graham just say? That's what many of the critics on the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party would like to hear President Trump say. They would like to hear him say that these members of the KKK, of these Nazi organizations, are un-American, are domestic terrorists, and are problematic. That's something he hasn't clearly said yet.
Now, we mentioned the Republicans who have been very critical. Ivanka Trump clearly drawing a distinction between what her father did and what she wanted to do. Again, this is not about the media, but if you want it to be, let's read you something from the conservative media. Stephen Hayes in the Weekly Standard writes, President Trump built his reputation with tough talk and harsh condemnations of people who earn his disapproval. That he refused to offer those things Saturday is no accident. How important is context here, and how the president has always called out his victims by name in his absence to do so now?
It's certainly worth paying attention to. Those of us who've covered the president on the campaign and in the White House know that when he feels passionately about something, when he thinks someone is wrong, whether they're actually wrong or not, he leans into them, and he's very vocal. And that was a very mild-tempered, red response, not anything that one would say even was some of the freewheeling or freestyling from the heart that he often does when he really has strong convictions about something. So the omission in the response is worth paying attention to, and we've seen quite a few people in his own party and the conservative media address that.
We have had the people around the president over the weekend working hard to be very forceful that there's no place for this kind of sentiment in our country, the hate and the bigotry. I want to listen to what General H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, said very specifically about hate in America.
When he condemned bigotry and hatred on all sides, that includes white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And I think it's clear, I know it's clear in his mind, and it ought to be clear to all Americans. We cannot tolerate, obviously, that bigotry, that hatred that is rooted in ignorance of what America stands for.
Is the president under pressure to come out and say those kinds of words himself now? People around him are starting to say it, and every time they do, it reminds us the president did not. He said he denounced from many sides, not neo-Nazis, not what was happening right there, but many sides. And some fear, it almost sounded like he was putting the paralegals who are standing there, you know,
many sides.
They're the other side.
The reason why there is going to be more pressure is because, with all due respect to McMaster, it's not clear to many Americans. And I think it's interesting and worth paying attention to. One of the groups where it's not clear to where the president stands is white supremacists themselves. We saw throughout the weekend on some of their message boards and some of their own media and some of their own tweets, they think that the president is on their side. They think he is one of them and that he endorsed their behavior. So you can't say that it's clear to Americans and to Republicans and Democrats where the president stands when you have Nazis themselves saying that he stands with them.
And you can see that the neo-Nazi site, the Daily Stormer. You know, I hate to even put it up on the screen because it's just garbage and horrible, but Trump comments were good. He didn't attack us. He just said the nation should come together, nothing specific against us. He said that we need to study why people are so angry and implied that there was hate on both sides. No condemnation at all. And then, of course, the people who study, this neo-Nazi stuff, they say, the president, what he didn't say, actually sent a dog whistle to white supremacists that this would be tolerated.
Yeah, this wasn't the first time it happened. If you can remember, actually about a year ago, when the president started his black voter outreach, most people who were listening were saying that many of his words were actually more attractive to people who have stereotypes and misperceptions about the black experience in America than it was to actually making an argument that would be attractive to black Americans. There's been dog whistling, some would say, for a whole year now, and for many people, this is the last straw.
Many trace this back to Steve Bannon inside this Trump administration. How long can he stick around? We'll ask you that in about 30 minutes, because some interesting comments from Anthony Scaramucci yesterday that made you think he might not be long.
Oh, yeah, we'll look at that in about a half an hour. All right, thanks, Eugene. The Department of Justice and the FBI launching a civil rights investigation into the deadly events at that white nationalist rally in Charlottesville. 20-year-old James Alex Fields is accused of driving his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one person. He is now in custody, facing multiple charges, including second-degree murder. He's expected to make his first court appearance today. CNN's Brian Todd has more on the suspect and the investigation.
Christine and Dave, we've got some important new information about the suspect accused in the car strike which killed that young woman on Saturday here in Charlottesville. According to our Justice producer, Mary Kay Maloney, she got this information from a Justice Department official familiar with the investigation. Federal investigators have enough evidence to be suspicious that the suspect, James Fields Jr., intended to send a message, not just harm the immediate victims. And they're looking into that. They are also looking into whether he had any accomplices, anybody who might have helped him in the attack. Some other information that we're getting about this suspect, according to a teacher who taught him history in the last 2 years of high school. This teacher's name is Derek Weimer, who taught him at a high school in northern Kentucky. He said that this suspect, James Fields, had some very disturbing views about Nazis, that he had an infatuation with Nazis. Now, this all comes as we come off at another day of high tension here in Charlottesville, because the organizer of that Saturday rally, the white supremacist organizer, Jason Kessler, showed up here on Sunday intending to hold a news conference. He spoke for several minutes at this outdoor news conference, but really didn't get much of a word in edgewise because a crowd of counter-protesters were shouting him down, making all sorts of noise. Some people converged on him slowly. At some point, he went down to the ground. He either fell or was pushed. The police swooped in, got him out of there, got him around the side of the building, and then into this building behind me, the Charlottesville Police Department, where they held him for his own safety, and then they whisked him away. A lot of protesters here angry that these white supremacists have hung around. At least one of these leaders, Jason Kessler, hung around to here in Charlottesville. Christine and Dave.
Brian Todd for us in Charlottesville. We're learning more about the 3 people who died in the Charlottesville violence. Heather Heyer was killed when that car plowed into a group of people protesting the white nationalist rally on Saturday. She was a paralegal who assisted clients through bankruptcy. Heather's mother says had passionate beliefs and was a champion for others.
It was important to her to speak up for people that she felt were not being heard, to speak up when injustices were happening. And she saw in the lives of many of her African American friends, particularly, and her gay friends, that equal rights were not being given.
Heartbreaking. 2 Virginia state troopers also being remembered this morning. Police say Lieutenant H.J. Cullen and Trooper Pilot Burke M.M. Bates were killed when their helicopter crashed while assisting public safety resources with the situation in Charlottesville.
All right, 11 minutes past the hour. Time for an early start in your money this morning. President Trump plans to get tougher on trade with China. Today, the president expected to direct the U.S. trade representative to look into alleged Chinese violations of trade with the U.S., things like patent thefts, intellectual property transfers. While this won't be an official investigation, it could lay the groundwork for one. If any wrongdoing is found, President Trump could impose tariffs against Chinese imports. But an editorial published today in a Chinese state-run newspaper says the investigation will poison the overall U.S.-China relationship. Although trade tensions between Washington and Beijing are ramping up, corporate America seems happy with China at the moment. U.S. companies have reported stronger second quarter earnings and revenue from their Chinese operations in recent weeks. 82% of U.S. companies in China expect revenue to increase this year, up from 76% a year ago. That's according to the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. They're benefiting from a Chinese economy growing at almost 7%, a Chinese housing boom, and a slide in the dollar, which makes American exports more competitive. It's interesting that article in the Chinese state-run paper as well, because, you know, we're also trying to, the United States government is trying to work with China on North Korea.
Yes.
So you've got a lot of different levels here where they're trying to work together.
Yeah, and on that, James Madison, Rex Tillerson writing in the Wall Street Journal that China specifically needs to do more to contain North Korea's nuclear threat. So that situation continues to evolve. Meanwhile, America's highest-ranking military officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting.
Much for that.
You wonder, are they speaking with one?
He was only on the job for 10 days, but former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci made clear today he has a strong opinion about one person still walking the halls of the West Wing, the president's chief strategist and former Breitbart executive Steve Bannon.
Well, I think the president knows what he's going to do with Steve Bannon.
Which is what?
Well, let's leave it up to the president. It's his decision. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think the president has a very good idea of who the leakers are inside the White House. The president has a very good idea of the people that are undermining his agenda that are serving their own interests.
They include Steve Bannon?
Well, yeah, like, you know, look, I mean, you know, we're not on a phone call and a tape phone call, and so we're on live television, and so I would prefer to let the president make the decisions that the president needs to make.
Joining us now, CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. So, Brian, it was just a couple of weeks ago, we here on CNN were reporting that the president did have some issues with Bannon, but ultimately had decided he was going to keep Bannon because he worried ousting him would hurt him with his base. Do you think the events yesterday change that in any way?
Not necessarily yesterday, but there's been this gradual push among some inside the White House to see Bannon go, and certainly from a lot of folks outside the White House to see Bannon go. I think we're reaching a sort of climactic point here with Bannon, where it seems his days are numbered, if you believe both the anonymous sources that are leaking to news outlets this weekend and some of the president's own former aides. There you go, right there, Anthony Scaramucci, all but saying that the knives are out for Steve Bannon inside the White House. Also notably today, H.R. McMaster was repeatedly asked by NBC's Chuck Todd if he supports Bannon and can work with him effectively in the West Wing, and McMaster avoided answering the question
He kind
times.
of dodged it when he was asked directly.
Exactly. The context for that is that some folks think Bannon's been behind a campaign against McMaster. So the infighting continues.
Exactly.
Last month it was Reince Priebus and others leaving the White House. Now it seems like Bannon could be the next to go, but the big caveat you got to add in all these conversations is that there's always a or maybe not. With President Trump, there's always a maybe not when it comes to these personnel issues, because he frequently changes his mind or floats trial balloons to see how people react and then doesn't actually act.
Now, Bannon's name has come up on the heels of this event that just happened in Charlottesville, this deadly tragic accident or terror event, some are calling it. Today, Democratic Congressman Maxine Waters tweeted this: Trump has made it clear with Bannon and Gorka in the White House and the Klan in the streets, it is now the white supremacists' house. Hashtag Charlottesville. She is not the first person to accuse Bannon of being a white supremacist. Give us a fact check here.
Yeah, you know, I think there are some extreme comments being made about Bannon that are not supported by any quotes he's ever said, not supported by any direct things he's ever said. The reason why folks try to tar Bannon as a white nationalist, or in the most extreme version, a white supremacist, is because when he was running Breitbart, basically this time last year, he left Breitbart and went over to the campaign. When he was running Breitbart, he described the site as the platform for the alt-right. And certainly there were some articles published on Breitbart at that time that you could point out and raise questions about. For example, there was a tag called Black Crime, articles emphasizing not crime, but black crime. Those sorts of issues at Breitbart are what I think have caused Bannon to be so scrutinized, so criticized by some Democrats. I'll leave it to Maxine Waters if she wants to provide proof that he's a white supremacist. I certainly wouldn't use that term to describe him. But yes, there are many Trump fans who feel Bannon is their voice in the White House, that Bannon channels their anger and their frustration. So it's a risk for President Trump to consider removing Bannon.
I want to ask you about Matt Drudge. He's the man behind the conservative news site, The Drudge Report. He's been an ardent supporter of the president, but lately he has been covering the White House in a different way. In fact, take a look at the front page of The Drudge Report today. It says, "Make America hate again. How much influence do you think he has with this administration? And could he and the Drudge Report end up being as much a risk for this president as it has been a help in the past?
Well, think about it. If you have someone like Bannon who leaves the White House, someone like that can be risky on the outside. So can these conservative media stars like Drudge, who have so far been pretty supportive of the president's agenda. If they were to turn on the president and be critical of him, basically taking shots at him and trying to take him down, that would be significant. And we've seen small signs, I don't want to overstate this, small signs of some conservative media support starting to erode. Drudge is one of those examples. I think what we've seen this weekend is an almost unprecedented, sort of unanimous, not unanimous, but as close as it's gotten so far, criticism of the president for his half-hearted response to Charlottesville. That's included GOP senators you've talked about, included some conservative media commentators. I think Drudge might have his finger up in the air trying to figure out what direction the winds are going. But it's worth paying attention to. These tea leaves matter because the president gets some of his news from these right-wing sites, from the Drudges of the world. He relies on them to provide support when he thinks the rest of the media is out to get him. So when you see sites like Drudge or you see Fox News stars seemingly expressing some skepticism about the president, it could be an indication of trouble for the president.
Brian Stelter, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Coming up, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle criticizing the White House response to the events in Charlottesville. So is the president's inaction bringing Republicans and Democrats together? We'll hear from one lawmaker next.
Everybody knows smoking is bad for you. But what you might not know.
He was only on the job for 10 days, but former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci made clear today he has a strong opinion about one person still walking the halls of the West Wing, the president's chief strategist and former Breitbart executive Steve Bannon.
Well, I think the president knows what he's going to do with Steve Bannon.
Which is what?
Well, let's leave it up to the president. It's his decision. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think the president has a very good idea of who the leakers are inside the White House. The president has a very good idea of the people that are undermining his agenda that are serving their own interests.
They include Steve Bannon?
Well, yeah, like, look, I mean, we're not on a phone call and a tape phone call, and so we're on live television, and so I would prefer to let the president make the decisions that the president needs to make.
Joining us now, CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. So, Brian, it was just a couple of weeks ago, we here on CNN were reporting that the president did have some issues with Bannon, but ultimately had decided he was going to keep Bannon because he worried ousting him would hurt him with his base. Do you think the events yesterday change that in any way?
Not necessarily yesterday, but there's been this gradual push among some inside the White House to see Bannon go, and certainly from a lot of folks outside the White House to see Bannon go. I think we're reaching a sort of climactic point here with Bannon, where it seems his days are numbered, if you believe both the anonymous sources that are leaking to news outlets this weekend and some of the president's own former aides. There you go, right there, Anthony Scaramucci, all but saying that the knives are out for Steve Bannon inside the White House. Also notably today, H.R. McMaster was repeatedly asked by NBC's Chuck Todd if he supports Bannon and can work with him effectively in the West Wing, and McMaster avoided answering the question three times.
He kind of dodged it when he was asked directly.
Exactly. The context for that is that some folks think Bannon's been behind a campaign against McMaster. So the infighting continues.
Exactly.
Last month it was Reince Priebus and others leaving the White House. Now it seems like Bannon could be the next to go, but the big caveat you got to add in all these conversations is that there's always a or maybe not. With President Trump, there's always a maybe not when it comes to these personnel issues, because he frequently changes his mind or floats trial balloons to see how people react and then doesn't actually act.
Now, Bannon's name has come up on the heels of this event that just happened in Charlottesville, this deadly tragic accident or terror event, some are calling it. Today, Democratic Congressman Maxine Waters tweeted this: Trump has made it clear with Bannon and Gorka in the White House and the Klan in the streets, it is now the white supremacists' house. Hashtag Charlottesville. She is not the first person to accuse Bannon of being a white supremacist. Give us a fact check here.
Yeah, I think there are some extreme comments being made about Bannon that are not supported by any quotes he's ever said, not supported by any direct things he's ever said. The reason why folks try to tar Bannon as a white nationalist, or in the most extreme version, a white supremacist, is because when he was running Breitbart, basically this time last year, he left Breitbart and went over to the campaign. When he was running Breitbart, he described the site as the platform for the the alt-right. And certainly there were some articles published on Breitbart at that time that you could point out and raise questions about. For example, there was a tag called Black Crime, articles emphasizing not crime, but black crime. Those sorts of issues at Breitbart are what I think have caused Bannon to be so scrutinized, so criticized by some Democrats. I'll leave it to Maxine Waters if she wants to provide proof that he's a white supremacist. I certainly wouldn't use that term to describe him. But yes, there are many Trump fans who feel Bannon is their voice in the White House, that Bannon channels their anger and their frustration. So it's a risk for President Trump to consider removing Bannon.
I want to ask you about Matt Drudge. He's the man behind the conservative news site, The Drudge Report. He's been an ardent supporter of the president, but lately he has been covering the White House in a different way. In fact, take a look at the front page of The Drudge Report today. It says, "Make America Hate Again." How much influence do you think he has with this administration? And could he and The Drudge Report end up being as much a risk for this president as it has been a help in the past?
Well, think about it. If you have someone like Bannon who leaves the White House, someone like that can be risky on the outside. So can these conservative media stars like Drudge, who have so far been pretty supportive of the president's agenda. If they were to turn on the president and be critical of him, basically taking shots at him and trying to take him down, that would be significant. And we've seen small signs, I don't want to overstate this, small signs of some conservative media support starting to erode. Drudge is one of those examples. I think what we've seen this weekend is an almost unprecedented, sort of unanimous, not unanimous, but as close as it's gotten so far, criticism of the president for his half-hearted response to Charlottesville. That's included GOP senators you've talked about, included some conservative media commentators. I think Drudge might have his finger up in the air trying to figure out what direction the winds are going. But it's worth paying attention to. These tea leaves matter because the president gets some of his news from these right-wing sites, from the Drudges of the world. He relies on them to provide support when he thinks the rest of the media is out to get him. So when you see sites like Drudge or you see Fox News stars seemingly expressing some skepticism about the president, it could be an indication of trouble for the president.
Brian Stelter, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Coming up, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle criticizing the White House response to the events in Charlottesville. So is the president's inaction bringing Republicans and Democrats together? We'll hear from one lawmaker next.
Everybody knows smoking is bad for you, but what you might not know
clearly railed against